You are listening to a sermon from River Community Church in Prairieville, Louisiana.
Here now from 1 Timothy chapter 3, I'll be reading verses 8 through 13. Deacons, likewise, must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience, and let them also be tested first. Then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. Their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. Let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their own households well. For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves, and also great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of our God endures forever. Please be seated. This morning we return to Paul's section on deacons in 1 Timothy 3 to discuss the meaning and application of verse 11, wherein he writes, "Their wives, likewise, must be dignified, not slanderers, sober-minded, faithful in all things." Now this is one of those verses that is just not as simple as it first may seem. Depending on how you translate it, this verse could be interpreted the way that ESV translates things, as a reference to the wives of the deacons, or you could take it to mean as the women deacons, or several of other alternatives about women who are in leadership in the church. The point of this sermon is not to cover all the options or do a super deep dive into the Greek or into the history of church practice, which is very varied. Rather, I am going to give you my own, hopefully well-informed opinion on the text, and then we'll work out that together in application. And by way of summary, I believe that 1 Timothy 3, 8 through 13 as a whole rules out the possibility of ordained female deacons, as we understand the office of ordained deacon. But it does not rule out the possibility of women serving in church leadership, even in diaconal type roles and responsibilities. Furthermore, as a consequence of what we believe about ordination, what it is and what it does, we should not ordain women into leadership into the church. Women can be unordained leaders in the congregation all over the place, just as men can be unordained leaders in the congregation all over the place. So we'll discuss the text under the following headings. First, we'll discuss whether the wives of deacons are in view, or some other form of leading women. Second, we'll discuss the ministry of these leading women. And third, we will discuss the character of these leading women. So first, wives or leading women? This is the big question when it comes to interpreting the Greek of verse 11, because the word gune can mean either woman or wife. The Greek language has no separate word for a wife. Rather, the way the New Testament speaks about wives is to say that a wife is a man's woman. We saw this in verses 2 and 12, where the elders and deacons must be, quote, the husband of one wife, but the Greek literally says a one-woman man. So if I wanted to say, this is my wife, I would say literally in Greek, this is my woman. If I was talking about your wife, I'd say your woman. The same applies in reverse for men, that there's no word for husband. A husband is a woman's man. Now, what does the text say? A more wooden translation of verse 11 would read, "Women, likewise, respectable, not slanderous, temperate, faithful in everything." There's no possessive pronoun in this verse that explicitly connects these women to the deacons. And so there's nothing in the text that explicitly requires that verse 11 be referring to the wives of the deacons. Greek can speak of women as wives without the use of the possessive pronoun, but this would be the exception to the rule as far as I understand things. The most natural way to understand this verse is that it refers to women as women, not to women as the wife of somebody. If Paul meant us to understand this verse as referring to the wives of deacons, he could have made that more clear. I have 3 further points here. First, the word likewise in verse 11 and the carryover of the verb must be from verse 2 communicates that Paul is now listing these women as a third category in his series of church leaders. Paul's use of grammar distinguishes these women from both the elders and the deacons, with the result that these women are not grammatically considered either elders or deacons. Nevertheless, they are recognized leaders in the church. Second, and less significant, I've never seen a compelling explanation for why the wives of deacons must meet certain character qualifications and deserve to be singled out, but not the wives of elders. Now, I might be able to get on board with the idea that this verse refers to the wives of both elders and deacons, and some put that idea forward, but grammatically, that connection is even less obvious than connecting these as the wives of deacons. Third and finally, these women are connected with the ministry of the deacons in some way, since verse 11 is sandwiched between Paul's instructions about deacons. Something makes Paul speak to the women in this verse and about these women while he is talking about the deacons. He shifts gears quickly without further comment. And honestly, this is the strongest argument in favor of the view that verse 11 is referring to the wives of the deacons. Because since Paul is moving into the household expectations of deacons, it makes sense of the flow of the argument for him to be referring first to the wives of the deacons. But, as I've said, I and many others don't think this interpretation does justice to the vocabulary and grammar of the verse itself. It might make the paragraph flow better, but it doesn't make sense of the verse itself. For these reasons, I believe Paul is speaking here about the leading women of the church. Any woman who occupies any place of any sort of recognized leadership position, whatever her title or responsibilities may be. Practically, I think Paul would have in mind a women's ministry coordinator. Women who are designated to help out in diaconal ministries as well as shepherding ministries. I think any female children's ministry coordinator, nursery coordinator, youth ministry assistant or leader, church secretary. I think Paul would have all these things in view as needing to meet the character qualifications of verse 11. Thomas Oden writes, "There can be no doubt that these were women in ministry, requiring qualifications for service, whose qualifications were set rhetorically right beside those of male deacons." Another author says, whether the women of verse 11 are deacons or not, Paul was singling out a group of women who serve the church in a recognized leadership capacity. Now, you should also know that the PCA does not take an official stance on this question. While the PCA Study Committee report favors the interpretation of wives, it doesn't state it to be the correct view. The view I'm espousing comes a very close second. So this is not a test of orthodoxy or even a test of your complementarianism. Likewise, it should be noted that all views agree that women should be involved in diaconal work. What the PCA prohibits is ordaining female deacons. That brings us to the second point, the ministry of these leading women. So question is, what are these leading women, these various female coordinators, to do? Using the Acts 6 principle of delegation, the women Paul refers to in 1 Timothy 3 are going to be women to whom the officers of the church entrust with special responsibilities. Responsibilities that either the elders don't have the time or ability to accomplish themselves, or perhaps the deacons have the time or ability to accomplish themselves, but also responsibilities that properly require a woman's involvement and not a man's. Some pastoral situations require a woman to be involved. Some ministries require a woman's touch. Isn't that obvious? There are some ministries that men don't need to be involved in, or especially not in charge of. Should one of the elders of the church be our nursery coordinator? Should one of the elders be the women's ministry coordinator? Should the elders and the deacons be regularly visiting the women of the church in their homes, especially the single women? When a woman in the church is going through a difficult situation in her marriage, or maybe in her personal health or reproductive health, wouldn't it be best for a mature woman to visit with her? If a woman is under discipline, wouldn't it be wise for a mature woman to walk alongside her and encourage her and be in her corner, an advocate? Not only can women be in ministry leadership in the church, there are some places we absolutely need them to be in leadership. In fact, the early church makes it pretty clear that even when deaconess became an official title in the early church, these women did not have the same office or set of responsibilities as male deacons. The ancient deaconesses were never treated as peers to the male deacons, serving right alongside their male counterparts. Rather, quote, their duties were restricted to serving the needs of the women in the church. Furthermore, given what Paul will say in chapter 5 and in Titus 2, I think Paul expected these leading women in the church to be older women, preferably widows, I think. Turn with me to chapter 5, verse 9. Paul writes, "Let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, and having a reputation for good works, if she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, has devoted herself to every good work. But refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. Besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander." One of the objections to the idea that verse 11 speaks to women ministry leaders or some sort of unordained or ordained female deacon is that the marital status of these women in verse 11 is not mentioned. There are requirements and reputation. Their character is much more abbreviated when compared to elders and deacons. But note here in chapter 5 that these enrolled widows are required to be first the wife of one husband. That is the exact parallel and mirror image of what's required of both elders and deacons. It's literally a one-man woman. She likewise has to have raised her children, shown hospitality, and proven herself in the church by serving in a variety of ways. I think perhaps Paul's comments about leading women in chapter 3 is so abbreviated because he intends to return to them in chapter 5 to discuss them under the heading of the enrolled widows. Also note chapter 5:11. Paul says, refuse to enroll the young widows. Why? Verse 14, I would have them marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. So it seems that Paul expected younger women of childbearing age, even if they were technically widows, to focus their ministry on the needs of their own children and of their own household. And the apostle's mind, a mother's children and her husband, if she has one, are her primary ministry. That is where her focus needs to be. Furthermore, a young single lady doesn't need to commit herself to the ministry of the church just yet. A young woman, we're not Catholic, but this puts a head on it, a young woman should not jump to being a nun. She shouldn't commit herself and take vows to the work of the church and the ministry of God. Rather, she should seek to marry a godly husband and raise a family for herself, should that be God's will. Once the children leave home, or if she's childless, then a woman should begin plugging herself into the ministry of the church. If she's so gifted, to lead in the ministry of the church. Not that a young mother or the mother of teenagers can't take a ministry leadership position or can't serve in a visible way. But if she does, the reality of the case is that her ministry will be divided. Her attention will be divided. When a mother's attention is divided, it is proper for her family to come first, yes? If a mother with children at home becomes a ministry leader, there will inevitably come a time where she will need to drop the church responsibility so that she can take care of her family responsibilities. There's something in the way that God wired men. We need to be available and present for home, but because we're made to work in the outside world, there are times where, as men, we need to handle stuff at the church as elders or as pastor because nobody else can do it. And sometimes our families do have to go without us, but a mom doesn't have that same option. When dad can't be there, mom has to be there. It's going to happen because that's motherhood. And I think what Paul is saying here, this general ethos of where a woman's ministry focus is, I think one of the benefits is that when this happens, when your kids need you, when your family needs you, when your parents or your in-laws need you, you're available to them, and you don't have to feel guilty, ladies, about letting a responsibility drop to the floor. Likewise, the church does not suffer because responsibilities are falling to the ground. Thus, it should generally be empty nesters, retired ladies, and widows who are doing the bulk of ministry leadership in the life of the church because they have fewer things that are pulling them away and are going to require their attention. But the flip side of this is a very real danger too. Women can become so very wrapped up in service and ministry in the church that they neglect their own families. One of our elders in Mississippi said this was true of his mom. And his siblings carried some resentment towards the church for a while. Women are service-hearted. and service-minded. And a woman's sense of self is very much tied into her service activities. It's how she communicates love. And with that, ministry, when a woman is committed to ministry in the church, that can so shape her relationship with the church and with God that ministry becomes an essential component of a woman's sense of assurance and of salvation. If I'm not serving the church, I don't know God loves me. She can't let God down, and so she lets her family down. But this is not God's desire for ladies, and it's damaging to the family. A woman cannot and should not give so much attention to the church that she becomes unavailable to her children or unavailable to her husband. That brings us to the third point, the character of these leading ladies. First, women who are ministry leaders must be dignified. This immediately connects these leading ladies again with the deacons, because it's the same word used to characterize the male deacons in verse 8. Anyone who is in a visible leadership position in the church, male or female, must be a dignified, respectable, honest human being. And part of what marks people as dignified and respectable is that they carry themselves with dignity and they treat other people with respect. Women, understand, women do not get a free pass in character just because they're women. It's assumed in Scripture, in this very word, that women are sinners too. Women can be immature in their faith. Women can be undignified, shameful, dishonorable, and undeserving of people's respect. Just the fact that a woman is female is not sufficient to put her in a ministry position any more than that a man is male. Just as with men, her character and reputation matters a great deal more than her skill set or her willingness to serve. Second, women must not be slanderous. This parallels the requirement that deacons not be double-tongued, but it focuses more on the problem posed by gossip. And gossip, my friends, is a particularly female sin. Men have sins that we are inclined to, lust and anger being at the top of the list. Gossip is one that tops the list for the ladies. Men can gossip, but women struggle not to gossip. It's a real challenge. However, for a woman to be qualified for church leadership, she has to have an uncommon grace of being tight-lipped about things. She must be careful about the information she shares because she will hear a lot of sensitive things about people in the life of the church. Proverbs 17:9 says, "Whoever covers an offense seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates close friends." Ladies, sharing the secrets of other people, even if it's true, can have a devastating impact on the peace and stability of the church. One of the questions that you need to ask yourself is this information mine to share? Because if you share information that the person telling you didn't mean for you to carry forward, people will stop opening up. People will stop confessing their sins. People will begin hiding in the shadows because they know word will get around. And this, in turn, will lead to a toxic, gossipy rumor mill that will divide the household of God and will drive wedges between family and friends. Men and women If somebody shares something deep to you about what's going on in their family or their home, you need to keep it to yourself unless they say you can share this with your husband. You can share this with the elders, whatever. Now, in particular, the word slanderous here refers to spreading a bad report about people. It's the word diabolos. It's closely linked with the diabolical work of the devil, the accuser of the brethren. Right? What's the work of the devil? He's the agent of condemnation and shame and destroying reputations. And a woman who shares a bad report about fellow church members does the same thing. She damages reputations. She magnifies a person's shame. She condemns people before the congregation of God in the court of public opinion. This is devilish work, and it must not be tolerated. Third, women who might be considered for leadership must be sober-minded. This is the exact same trait mentioned for elders in verse 2. It's repeated in Titus 2, verse 3, when it says, older women must not be slaves of much wine, echoing the requirement of deacons. We said of elders, this refers to a person's temperance and moderation, self-control. It's not a requirement of total abstinence, but it requires self-control when it comes to what you consume. A woman who would be a leader in the church cannot be the type of woman who spends her mornings drinking cocktails and her evenings drinking wine. Women are just as capable of becoming functioning alcoholics as men, and it's just as bad. A leading woman in the church must maintain control of her appetites, therefore. Whether it's for alcohol, but this issue of temperance is beyond alcohol. It might apply to things like food. It might apply to things like chocolate. A woman's master must be Christ, not what she consumes. Remember that it was Eve's desire that was out of control to eat the forbidden fruit that led to the fall. It was her appetite, her taste. Finally, a woman who would be in ministry must be faithful in all areas. She must be a trustworthy woman. She must be the type of person who is faithful in her relationships, faithful to her husband, faithful to her children, faithful to her friends, faithful to her parents and to her in-laws. She must be trustworthy in her various responsibilities, trustworthy with the family checkbook and credit cards, trustworthy with the children's education, whatever her responsibility with that, even if it's just making sure they get on the bus in the morning. Trustworthy in her job, if she has one. Trustworthy with the information that's given to her. And she must be a woman who is full of faith. She trusts God. She leans not on her own understanding. She's not overcome with anxiety. She's a woman of prayer. She's maturing in her faith, and she's bearing good fruit. In other words, if a woman would be a leader in the church, she must be a Proverbs 31 kind of woman. Turn there with me. Page 929 in my Bible, but I don't think any of you have the same print that I do. Proverbs 31, beginning in verse 10. An excellent wife who can find? She's far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She is like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from afar. She rises while it is yet night and provides food for her maidens. Provides food for her household and portions for her maidens. She considers a field and buys it, and with the fruit of her hands she plants a vineyard. Note the intentionality and activity of the Proverbs 31 woman. This is not a woman who's tied down at home. She's out and about and doing things to improve her home situation. She dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. That doesn't sound like your typical trad wife. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hands to the distaff and her hands hold the spindle. She opens her hand to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of snow for her household, for all her household are clothed in scarlet. She makes bed coverings for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them. She delivers sashes to the merchant. Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come. In other words, she's not anxious or fretting about things. She has a sense of joy and levity about the future. Where was I? There it is, 26. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. This, my friends, is what every woman should endeavor to be. Every woman should desire to be a more faithful, diligent, intentional, fruitful, successful, and mature woman of God who clothes herself in strength and is trustworthy in all areas. Let's not get tied up in the problem of titles and offices and privileges. Christ himself came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. He blatantly refused to receive the titles that people wanted to give him. Neither women nor men in the church should be in pursuit of titles or power or influence in the church. Rather, we should focus our hands and minds on the responsibilities that God has already given us. Serve where he has already given us responsibilities. And whether you're a man or a woman, elder or deacon, a layperson, God expects you to serve him first in your family. God expects you to prove yourself faithful to him first in your home. And then, if you have a healthy family, if you have a settled family that is bearing good fruit, then you are encouraged to serve in the family of faith, the household of God, the church of Jesus Christ. Then, and only then.
Thank you for listening to this sermon from River Community Church in Prairieville, Louisiana, where you will always find biblical preaching, meaningful worship, and the equipping of disciples. For more information on River Community Church and its ministries, please visit rivercommunity.org.